I'm Jackson Shea, the current president of the Portland and Southwest Washington chapter. Um, Thank you all so much for joining us. We are collaborating with the chapters from Alaska, and we have representation from Alaska, Washington, Oregon, and hopefully we'll get some of the folks from California. But it seems like we do have participants from all over, which we're thrilled about. So want to so quickly. Thank you most of all to Emily for organizing this and getting us together and giving us this wonderful chance to pretend to be students again and engage with Professor Reiko Hillyer and also each other as around her recently published book on the permeability of the membrane barrier between the imprisoned and the outside. In addition to a rigorous approach to this topic, she brings valuable personal experience from her own work, from her work with the Inside Out Prison Exchange Program, which greatly enriches the academic and personal lives of both LC students and the incarcerated. So Professor Hillyer is an associate professor of history and also currently the department's chair as well, with a specialty in the American South, African American history, and the built environment and mass incarceration. So without me taking up any more oxygen, Reiko, please take it away. Oh, sorry. Before, I will also be leading the Q&A afterwards. And so, people, as they have questions, go ahead and please drop it into the chat and I'll capture them and I'll call on you folks to go ahead and ask those questions after Reiko's presentation. So, thank you.
Hi, thank you so much for taking the time, everyone, and to Emily and Jackson and everyone else who organized this. It's a real honor to have your attention and to get to talk about something that's really important to me. So my book, which will be the subject of today's talk, is A Wall is Just a Wall, The Permeability of the Prison in the 20th Century United States. And what I mean by permeability is to say that I'm tracking the ways in which prison walls have become more thick in relationship to the outside world, the thickening of prison walls, by which I mean in earlier decades, and in fact for most of the 20th century, the prison was much more porous than it is today. There was much more fluidity between inside and outside. And I explore the sort of normality of that and then the demise of those practices by focusing on three central aspects of prison life. One is clemency, which is to say the executive power of the governor to commute sentences or pardon people so that they can be released from prison after whatever amount of time. Another practice that I trace is the rise and fall of conjugal visits or family visits, during which a spouse or family member could go inside the prison and stay in relative privacy in an accommodation separate from the normal prison residence and spend several nights sometimes with their loved ones. And I also track the demise of furlough, which is the practice by which incarcerated people could leave temporarily for various purposes, sometimes for a day, sometimes for several days, sometimes for 10 days, and return to prison. All of these practices were robust, routine, if not universal, and they all sort of peaked around the 1970s, 80s, and then rapidly began to decline. And so what I'm trying to trace is sort of the philosophies and motivations behind those practices and the ideologies and so forth that led to their demise. And so what I'd like to do is just begin by reading a little bit, and then I'll sort of expand from the parts that I'm reading and talk about the basic structure of the book a little bit more. Sound good? Okay. And then, of course, I'll talk about how it is I came to write this book. Well, maybe I should start with that. The reason why I'm unprepared is that I've now become quite practiced with speaking without notes. And I have a story about that, which is that I was recently invited to Norfolk Prison, which is Massachusetts, and Massachusetts State Penitentiary, medium security, or no, it's a maximum security prison in Norfolk, Massachusetts, about 45, 50 minutes from Boston. And this was a prison that was built and founded in 1927 as a model penal colony designed to maximize the interaction between the incarcerated people and the outside world. That was its mission. And it was designed architecturally to mimic a college campus. They borrowed from Harvard, sort of federal style, and it did not have fences or high walls isolating it from the community. College debate teams regularly came inside the prison from MIT and Harvard, debating Toastmasters inside the prison on prison teams that included Malcolm X between 1948 and 1952 when he was incarcerated there. So it was, a terrible place as described by Malcolm X, but there was this understanding that there was more fluidity between the inside and the outside. When I visited in August, it was very clear, not a surprise to me, that everything had changed. And one single example of that is that I was not allowed to bring paper inside the prison because there is a fear that drugs will be sprayed onto the paper. And what this means is that incarcerated people can't get regular mail. The mail has to be scanned off-site and then sent to them digitally on tablets. So they're lucky enough to have tablets. And I am so grateful that after my talk, Duke University and the prison administration both agreed to have my PDF, the PDF of my book, uploaded to those tablets. And now 5,700 incarcerated people have copies of my book. So there's a way in which that electronic device allows them more access, and yet they can't hold a piece of paper, right? A card from their loved ones. So I'm tracking how this came to be. How is it that the prison has become so impermeable? This was not always so. And one of the things that drove me to consider this question was my experience teaching this Inside Out class, which I'm happy to talk about more later. But this is a class in which 15 undergraduates from Lewis and Clark go inside Columbia River Correctional Facility every Friday for 3 hours to take a class with 15 incarcerated students. And this is an integrated class where all students are equal. Every story matters. Every student has a voice. And we study the history of mass incarceration and sort of braid a scholarly understanding of broad historical forces with the lived experience of the folks whom the system affects most directly. And the experience in that class is incredibly precious, as you can imagine, and in large part because that encounter is so taboo, it's so rare. And so I began to ask, has this always been so? Has it always been so unusual for outside folks to come in this way? And the answer is no. And so my personal experience teaching that class and sort of, trying to enact what it would feel like to sort of break down those walls is a great portion of what influenced me to explore this theme. In so doing, I began to do research on a prison strike in Virginia in 1968. And I was thinking about the prison litigation and the extent to which incarcerated people had access to the courts and so forth. So I was becoming introduced to this concept of how it is that people who are inside can or cannot access the mechanisms of civil society. And in doing this research, I was focused on the Virginia State Penitentiary, which is right in downtown Richmond. And I write about a protest that happened outside the walls of the prison in the middle of downtown. And people downtown hearing people inside screaming, thank you, And I was thinking about that sort of proximity, this prison downtown, the protesters there. And I was exploring the archives of the Virginia State Penitentiary as well as the governor's papers. And I came across a series of executive orders from the governor commuting sentences, releasing people on furlough regularly. And this is in 1968, right? This is the height of social turmoil. A conservative backlash is gaining its spine in Virginia. And in the middle of all of this mayhem, the governor is releasing people who are incarcerated for violent crimes so that they can go play a chess match in a local high school chess tournament. And I began to wonder, how could this be? And why did such practices disappear? So I'm going to read a little bit now. Oh. Prison walls have not always been impermeable, and permeability has been both a vehicle for social control and a way for prisoners to resist it. During 1 month in 1968, dozens of men incarcerated at Louisiana State Penitentiary, the notorious prison known as Angola after the former plantation grounds it occupies, were allowed to leave temporarily for various purposes. Under supervision and rigorously screened, members of Angola's Bridge Club traveled to play in bridge tournaments. Imprisoned participants in Alcoholics Anonymous and Narcotics Anonymous spoke at schools, churches, and business associations throughout the state. A country and western band composed of 6 incarcerated men, the Westernaires, played as many as 3 concerts a week at nursing homes, hospitals, and high schools. That same year, a beloved television cowboy known as Buckskin Bill, who earned fame for his children's show, Storyland, invited the Westernaires to star in their own weekly television show, Good Morning, Angola Style. Angola's JCs, a chapter of the National Leadership Training and Civic Organization, traveled nearly 200 miles to Monroe, Louisiana, to attend a 2-day JC convention, where their branch won a standing ovation at the opening banquet. Some of these men, like many of those at Angola, had been convicted of murder, kidnapping, or armed robbery. The journeys of these traveling ambassadors were documented and celebrated in a feature story in the Angolite, the prison magazine produced by men incarcerated at the Louisiana State Penitentiary. Significantly, this article was reprinted in a local Free World newspaper, the Reign Acadian Tribune, demonstrating the public's attention to the sojourners. The anonymous author used his viewpoint column in the Angolite to assert that these trips were crucial to informing the public that a convict was not, quote, a brute dressed in a striped suit and restrained by a ball and chain, unquote. Mobility served a larger purpose than temporary escape or even personal expression. Logging thousands of miles, Angola's ambassadors would, quote, carry the truce to the public, unquote, the reporter declared. Though corrections officials often explained that the privilege of leaving the prison under these sanctioned conditions served the purpose of rehabilitation, incarcerated travelers perceived their exposure to the public as opportunities to rehabilitate the crude stereotypes held by those who called themselves law-abiding citizens. They hoped to prove, quote, the simple lesson: the convict, despite his faults and failings, is not an ogre. He is little different from the rest of the people who populate these United States. And the sooner all folks come to realize that the majority of convicts present no threat to them or their way of life, the sooner these walls will come tumbling down. Skipping ahead. Traveling outside the walls of Louisiana State Penitentiary was part of a broader logic that assumed and accepted that almost everyone imprisoned in Angola would eventually get out. Until the late 1970s, even those with life sentences were routinely released after 10 years and 6 months via commutation from the governor, as long as they kept a good prison record. Thus, prisoners' withdrawal from free society was understood to be temporary, and their visits outside nourished the connective tissue that would help secure their eventual reintegration into the body politic. By interacting with the public, incarcerated people could develop a sense of dignity beyond the reductive labels imposed by the criminal justice system. And by contributing to society through music, lectures, or charity work, they could counter the public's perceived ideas about convicts. The traveling ambassadors refused stigma and social disfranchisement by claiming a positive identity beyond the site of the prison and by developing a track record of accomplishments that would earn them early release. Norris Henderson, who began serving his life sentence at Angola for second-degree murder in 1977, recalls being allowed to leave the prison so frequently as a member of the JCs, the Lifers Club, and the prison football team that he took traveling as a given. But by the late 1980s, those travels had nearly disappeared. Law and Order District Attorney Harry Connick Sr. ominously warned the Louisiana public in 1979, quote, "The truth is few convicted criminals are sent to the penitentiary, and of those criminals who are sent to Angola, virtually none of them ever serves his full sentence." Disgusted by a suite of practices designed to, quote, "reduce the terms of prisoners sent to jail," unquote, Connick railed against the furloughs, work release, pardon, and commutation, some of which had been Louisiana tradition for the better part of the 20th century and were fervently supported by corrections administrators. New legislation prohibited the granting of furloughs to those convicted of violent crimes, drug crimes, or habitual offenses, eliminating nearly all men at Angola from eligibility. After a prisoner working in the governor's mansion killed his girlfriend while out on furlough in 1988, Governor Buddy Roemer suspended furloughs indefinitely. This will be the last part I'll read right now. In 1970, just 143 people were serving life without parole sentences in Louisiana. By 2021, the lifer population had grown to 4,400. While the increasing separation from the prison from free society has redrawn the prison boundary, incarcerated people are also restrained by a tightened temporal boundary that fastens them to their past. Nonetheless, prisoners change just as the prison has changed around them. They continue to hope, grow, work, and serve one another, demonstrating that they are not the same people they were when they committed their original crimes. Darren James, who has served 30 years since being incarcerated at age 19, has been involved in the Islamic community and Alcoholics Anonymous, but he's most proud of the work he has done in prison hospice, a feature of prison that has developed in response to its aging population. As James notes, quote, "We're human beings. We make mistakes, but I'm not my worstest mistake. I am not that person." Darrell Waters also presses beyond the confines of his original conviction. Quote, "All we regard is a thug on the street 24, 25 years ago. So we're angry at that person, not realizing that that person doesn't exist for at least 20 years, unquote. These men refuse to be turned to stone. They also know that the laws that keep them locked up are not written in stone. In 1968, in the middle of Jim Crow, people had a greater chance of leaving a brutal Louisiana prison, either temporarily or by early release, than they would 50 years later. For those incarcerated during those 50 years, the ground has shifted dramatically. We now understand that mass incarceration is relatively new. What is even newer is mass disappearance. So what I mean when I say mass disappearance, it's to say that there's this increasing impulse to permanently exile people who had once been understood as a public responsibility, and for us in the free public to absorb. And that common sense has dramatically changed. And so I'm interested in excavating the past to think about different kinds of common sense without romanticizing the past. I have no interest in sentimentalizing the Jim Crow South, but it's just to demonstrate, as historians try to do, the malleability of what is, and that the world that we take for granted as fixed and natural is something that is made and can be unmade. So one of the impulses that drew me to this topic, in addition to discovering those chess players in Virginia, was the hubbub that emerged in 2012 when Republican governor of Mississippi, who had a Confederate flag in his office, Haley Barbour, commuted the sentences of over 200 people at the end of his term. And there was an outcry across the board, and he defended his action as consistent with Mississippi tradition. And I found that fascinating. And so I began to investigate what this Mississippi tradition was. And so the first 3 chapters of the book about clemency start in Mississippi. And clemency was not something that was unique to Mississippi, but I'll discuss in a minute why I focus there. Clemency as a general practice was vigorously used in all 50 states for most of the 20th century as a routine part of a governor's job. It was understood that the justice system was fallible. It was understood that a life sentence should probably not exceed more than 10 to 15 years. And it was understood that people change over time. In the American South, clemency has a particular valence because of the tradition of Jim Crow. When the prison system was really institutionalized in the late 19th century, it was a response, of course, to emancipation, and therefore was essentially a gulag meant to entrap formerly enslaved people, disfranchise them, and use them for labor. So there was not really a pretense of rehabilitation, and there was, of course, a world of terrorism and discrimination and harassment outside prison walls. But governors in the South still saw clemency as a very important feature of expressing their benevolence and expressing the legitimacy of their system. If, in fact, someone who was commuted engaged in misbehavior, surely there were incredibly terrifying means to correct that. And so perhaps, as I say in the book, the world beyond the prison also resembled an armed camp. Governors could afford that kind of fluidity. So we don't want to romanticize the conditions under which clemency was granted. Which is to say, too, that the form racism took was very different than it would take later. Clemency was the kind of velvet glove of racist paternalism, rewarding good behavior, but more often allowing outside employers to have access to that work. So you see in the archives lots of letters to the governor. My wife is in need of a maid. Do you have a prisoner who might be, useful in that regard? Or, my husband is debilitated. We have crops to harvest. Do you have someone you could let out and work for us? Okay. And so there was a correlation between that exploitation of labor that happened within the prison and the motivations for clemency. I talk a lot about the practice of using incarcerated people as workers or servants in the governor's mansion. This was a practice for most of the 20th century, and it was most prolific in the American South. The governor would request maybe 10 to 12 incarcerated people from Parchman Farm in Mississippi, for example, or Angola, and they would probably universally be people who are convicted of murder, first or second degree murder. It was understood. I mean, that the logic was those folks usually do that in a crime of passion. They're not inherently dangerous. They're probably less dangerous than the thief. It's robbers and thieves who are more incorrigible. So I actually can trust these folks living in my house with me. And they also have the most to gain, because if they show good behavior, I will promise to release them at the end of my term. And this happened universally throughout the American South, where this practice happened, all the way through the early 1990s. In Louisiana, it was common practice for most of the 20th century to follow what was called the 10-6 rule, which was that people, even serving life sentences for murder, if they exhibited good behavior, would submit a petition to the warden, and the warden would look it over. And if their disciplinary record was good, the governor would rubber stamp a commutation after 10 years and 6 months. And people pled guilty and conducted themselves with the idea that their reward would be that they would be let out. So this was a routine practice that then starts to become a political third rail in the 1990s. In the 1990s, we also have the demise of conjugal visits and furlough, and I'll get to why these all decline in a moment. But first, I'll just talk about the commonality of these practices. Conjugal visits, again, like clemency, are a practice that I trace to the American South, or I focus on in the American South, because they began first in Mississippi. Conjugal visits were regarded as a kind of reward or a safety valve for laborers who, again, as I said, were not considered to be worthy of any sort of rehabilitation. So that language was not used to explain or justify or govern prison practices. Instead, the idea was to keep the morale of the laborers up. And so there was a practice of allowing sex workers, but also wives, to come and visit the prison and spend maybe 24 hours in a cabin with their partners. And this practice was something that was common in Mississippi, and then, interestingly, was taken up by Governor Ronald Reagan in the 1960s, because by that time, there was a concern about prison unrest. There was a concern about so-called situational homosexuality. There was concern about prison rebellion. And Governor Ronald Reagan, who wanted to squelch rebellion and shore up the heterosexual nuclear family, looked to Mississippi as a model of a practice that could offer a safety valve for tension and the practice of sort of rehearsing normative family values. And so Ronald Reagan, who knew and expressly said, because of his conservative bona fides, he felt that he had the political freedom to enact what he thought was a common sense policy. And then other states followed suit. Washington, there were something like 17 states. I don't know what all of them are. So between like the 1960s and the 1980s, about 17 states, I believe, took up this practice. And the idea was, again, that the incarcerated person could be best rehabilitated by having the opportunity to experience normality as often as possible and maintain a connection and a commitment to family. And so conjugal visits could be used as a carrot, and eventually they were taken away. And that decline happens also in the 1990s. The third practice I look at is furlough. And again, I begin in the American South because furlough was regularly practiced in the Jim Crow South in the context of what was called Christmas leaves, where people would leave prison because of the governor's, temporary commutation for a furlough for about 10 days to go home for Christmas. And this was, again, routine practice. It was uncontroversial. Even if people didn't come return, it was not particularly controversial. And again, this was a pretty robust and routine practice in the American South. And people on furlough are going out, again, not only to labor, but maybe attend to family affairs. There's a case, situation in Texas I read about where the warden took a bunch of prisoners to a high school basketball game in civilian clothes, just blending in with everybody else. You've got these folks that I mentioned in the book who are going out to do charity work or give talks. Wilbert Rideau, who was a famed prison journalist in Louisiana State Penitentiary, who was incarcerated for over 40 years, regularly left prison to give talks. And all of this was happening throughout the 20th century. Then I focus specifically on Massachusetts in my last two chapters because I want to set up a kind of prequel to the Willie Horton scandal that leads to the demise of furlough and eventually clemency, knocking all of these practices down in a kind of domino effect. Massachusetts actually had an incredibly liberal furlough policy that allowed people, even serving life sentences for murder, were allowed furlough. And the understanding behind that was that even people serving life would not actually serve life. And that, I'm quoting from a court case here that determined that people serving life should be eligible for furlough, that people were commuted so regularly and nobody ever died of old age in prison, that even people who are serving life should be allowed furlough because they're eventually going to get out. And this is an important practice for them to readjust to society. So again, it was understood as common sense. It was understood that it was the public's responsibility to absorb these folks. And it was understood that practices like furlough and conjugal visits would accrue to a record that could demonstrate to a governor that this person has grown and changed over time and can be trusted in the free world. Willie Horton himself said, people should not get commuted without furlough, because if you are locked up for that many years in this inhumane environment, you are not going to be able to adjust in a healthy way, right? So even incarcerated people, and even the symbol of, sort of the boogeyman of furlough saw that. So I'm just going to read another short little piece that is about furlough. This is in Massachusetts, and I'm reading it because I enjoyed writing it. Peter Makarowitz enjoyed planting tomatoes in the garden. After patting down the soil, he mowed the backyard lawn and sat down to breakfast with his mother and sister. He was not used to talking to women, but these ladies were family. It was a thrill to drink coffee out of a heavy mug emblazoned with "World's Greatest Uncle" and eat his eggs with real heavy silverware. Once it was time to leave, Makarowitz had to steady himself as he maneuvered through the living room furniture. To him, it looked like a hoarder's dollhouse. There was so much stuff, and yet it all seemed tiny. He was used to wide spaces, long corridors, and empty rooms. Makarowitz walked to the corner store, screwed up his nerve, and asked to buy a pack of cigarettes, flinching when the bell on the door jangled as he exited the store. When he returned to his mother's home, she was waiting with her car running to take him, waiting with her car running to take him back to the Massachusetts Correctional Institution, where he continued to serve a life sentence for murder. So what happened? In the 1990s, we've got this wave of tough on crime legislation that emerges as a new bipartisan common sense. And this is the era, of course, of mandatory minimums, of truth in sentencing, which reduces parole. You've got an increasing number of crimes for which people can be incarcerated. You've got lengthening sentences, and you've got the decline of parole. And in this context, the public mood, or at least the politicians, are manufacturing a public mood that is increasingly intolerant of risk. And this is a moment where I think that the ideas about risk are being redefined, to think about incarcerated people as permanently and immutably dangerous, and that the public is entitled to zero risk all the time from any kind of harm. Whereas in an earlier generation, it was considered to be more risky to keep people incarcerated without any contact with the outside world. So our understanding of risk has reversed. Our understanding of redeemability has disappeared. Whereas earlier it was understood that people do change over time. And this concept was institutionalized in clemency guidelines written by governors. So for example, Governor Dukakis's clemency guidelines do not mention the original crime as something that should be considered in order to determine whether someone should deserve clemency. What counts is has the person changed? Has the person grown? You know, what has the person's behavior been in prison? What kind of accomplishments has that person achieved, right? By 2011, 2012, the early 2000s, Governor Deval Patrick, a Black Democrat, rewrote his clemency guidelines, as every executive has the right to do. And the foremost consideration is the nature of the original crime. So people get frozen in amber at their original crime and become tethered to that as their identity and as a measure of risk, which is, by the way, not based in fact, because studies show that people who have been incarcerated for a long time, who have been convicted of the most violent crimes, are actually the least likely to commit new crimes when they really are released from prison. Recidivism rate for people who've committed murder and been commuted is actually less than 1%. So we've created an idea of sort of permanently incorrigible, irredeemable people. And the rules around furlough are the same. I mean, now furlough doesn't exist barely at all. But in 1988, Arizona changed its furlough eligibility from behavior in prison, that should determine eligibility for furlough. And then in 1988, it changes to the nature of the crime. Okay. Alongside this is a new language that is attached to the war on welfare. And this is a language that is promoting austerity and meanness and an intolerance for people who are not able to be productive workers, right? And the language that is used to demonize people who receive welfare is the same language that was used for incarcerated people, the programs that served incarcerated people, right? So you get this language of country club prisons and this idea of criminals who are lying around with caviar and chandeliers, with yoga classes and all this stuff. And so with the idea of longer sentences comes the idea of harsher conditions. And this is a movement that people have called the penal harm movement, that it's not enough to be incarcerated for a long time. People have to serve hard time, that they need to suffer, that life inside has to be demonstrably worse than life outside. And the theory was not that prison should be a place of rehabilitation, but that prison should be a deterrent. And this was the logic, that if prison is so horrible, this is going to deter people from committing other crimes. That was the more reasonable explanation. The more punitive and sort of mean-spirited explanation, or I would say the vengeful explanation, is that folks who have committed these crimes deserve to continually suffer. And this also has to do with the rise of the ways in which victims' rights movements have been co-opted and sort of making an equivalent. Well, if I'm suffering because of the loss of my loved one, the person who perpetrated this also has to continually suffer as long as they're alive. And no person who is inside prison should have any privilege that I don't have access to, right? And if I don't have access to my husband, then they shouldn't have access to theirs. I'm running out of time, so I'm just going to close by talking a tiny bit about my Inside Out class. Coming back to what it is to try to refuse those walls. Creating possibilities to collapse the boundaries between inside and outside is a practice of refusing the ideological and material boundaries that produce disposable and punishable categories of people. The practice of encounter between inside and outside cuts through media sensationalism, political posturing, fear-mongering, and panic. Through getting close, we embody the possibility that things could be otherwise. As political philosopher Lisa Gunther has said of building bridges between inside and outside prison, quote, "This is what abolition looks like. The creation of new ways of thinking, seeing, feeling, speaking, and experiencing a world that is shared in common with all other human beings. So coming together is a small act of resistance at the scene of the crime itself, unquote. Henry, who's an incarcerated student whom I quote earlier in the book, recognized the possibility of creating a collective that would resuscitate prisoners from social death and practice and otherwise that could transcend the finite nature of our class. So I'm ending with his words. His name was Ben. I say Henry, but his name was Ben. At the end of the class, this is what he said to his fellow students. Our time together has not truly come to an end. This world we've created is in no way transitory. We carry it beyond the threshold of these doors. Inside, we go on to mentor others as we carry your faces and words in our hearts, remembering that you treated us as human beings. You go on to continue building the world around you and how you interact, love, vote, and speak to power. We will always have the context we shared together. No one can take that from us, and no one can stop us from recreating what is possible to create with others. So with that, I will close and open for questions.
Wow, that's so powerful. I had the really good fortune of attending the Ray Warren symposium last week on race and gender, or sorry, race and ethnic studies. And at the welcome reception, Ray's brother spoke very eloquently, as he has in the past, and he reminded us that if Ray was here with us to command us to examine the beliefs that we hold, and as we learn from the symposium, to try to gain new truths from from what we learn. And your book has done exactly that. It's like, the South, racism South wasn't all bad, and liberal policies aren't always good, and conservative policies aren't always bad. And that we don't always learn from our mistakes and progress towards the future. So, no, thank you so much for those illuminations. So, especially at the end there, you talked about the Willie Horton event and how there's been this recurring theme of politicians leveraging the anger and indignation of victims and their loved ones to enact these more, tougher sentencing guidelines and removing prisoners' rights. So, being that I had a philosophy degree, I was very interested in the ethical dilemma that this posed. How do we balance the rights of, what seems to be a right to revenge by the victims and their families versus a right for redemption? And on the face of it, that seems obvious that the right to revenge is not nearly as valuable to greater society as the right to redemption and the right for prisoners to grow. So this seemed to me like definitely a creation of non-personhood for incarcerated people. So can you explore a little bit further of like how we've moved that needle to that state of creating non-personhood?
Yeah. Wow, that's a very, very big question. But I will take up what I can and see if I don't meander too far off. I was talking with my students in my upper level history colloquium the other day, which is focused on the historiography of American slavery. So we're looking at how different historians over time have studied and understood and explored American slavery, depending on the questions they ask and the sources they use. What are their arguments? How are they in conversation with each other, and so on. And we had just read about emancipation and abolition. And so I thought that I would introduce the concept of abolition democracy. The concept of abolition democracy emerges from W.E.B. Du Bois. And it's this idea that the end of slavery does not produce freedom, right? Freedom, true substantive freedom, is not just an absence of slavery. What emerged instead, though, with the New South and the rise of Jim Crow, and it was obviously a system of racist subjugation, but it also was a system of capitalist notions of free market freedom, right? The idea that freedom is earned through individual competition in the marketplace and personal responsibility. One of the things that present day abolitionists look to is the way in which formerly enslaved people defined freedom. It was not the freedom to compete or the freedom to be an autonomous individual. It was the freedom to build families, the freedom to be educated, the freedom to have sustenance, and the freedom from violence, and the freedom to engage in mutual aid and kin networks that would allow everybody to flourish. And that's a very different definition of freedom. So when present day prison abolitionists are calling back to slavery, when they use the word abolition, in many ways, they are not being metaphorical. They see the prison system today as an extension or adaptation of slavery. But they're also looking to abolition democracy, which is to say a vision of freedom where more people can flourish, where the good of everyone is paramount, and that the production of wealth is not for the few, or just the able-bodied, but is meant to enrich everyone, right? And so we began talking about how that is also related to different conceptions of justice. Is justice revenge? Is justice punishment? Or is justice making amends, reducing harm, preventing future harm, ensuring everybody's well-being, resolving conflict, right? These are very different definitions of justice, right? And in my Inside Out class, there was one experience a few years ago, not last time, but the time before, I was experimenting with this idea of creating a theater piece. And one line that a student wrote was, "Does justice require prison to heal what has been broken?" And to your question, yes, these are very different definitions of justice, right? Justice as punishment, and justice as harm reduction or healing. And I think that the construction of non-personhood is in a sense essential for the first version of justice. You have to essentially cast out that person as no longer worthy of civic membership, right? Now there may be people who need to be restrained, right, in some way. I mean, I don't doubt that is true, but that is a different question in a way than whether or not you're going to continually punish someone who has transgressed for something that happened a long time ago, when that person may no longer be that same person, just as we all are not the same person as we were 20 years ago. Who among us would want to be frozen at our worst moment? And so I think that, what I hope that the class does in part, is to sort of create a space of affective rehearsal for what it feels like to bring people back into our community and look at each other as human beings, and just in a person-to-person, human-to-human way, right? This is not itself going to change policy, and I'm not a policy maker. But what I'm interested in as an educator and as a historian is to think about how we can create spaces where the simple interaction of meeting someone eye to eye can totally transform what you think is common sense.
Wow, that's stunning. And as you highlighted, policies have progressively done more harm than good. So it's that interpersonal interaction that is really going to change. Um, Brooke has a question. Please go ahead and unmute.
Hi, Professor Hillier. I had you for a seminar
Hi.
in 2013 or 2014. I don't remember which,
Yes. Oh my
but it's
goodness.
nice
Hello.
to be here. I'm now a criminal defense attorney, so this is right up my alley. I spend a lot of time in detention centers. Um, Something that I just wanted to touch on that about what Jackson said. I'm in New Mexico. We have a huge Native American population. So there are some really interesting, if you're interested in delving into it, non-Western Native American dispute resolution practices that actually focus on healing as opposed to retribution. And so I've seen some of those tensions when a Native American client gets caught up in the Western system, just not understanding why we're being so adversarial. But just something that you might want to look at if you're interested in that.
Absolutely. That's fascinating. Thank you.
Yeah. So I'm wondering, and full disclosure, I haven't read your book yet,
Okay.
but I don't know if, at what point you stopped looking at the increased restrictions around prisons and accessing inmates. But I have seen as a defense attorney a huge dramatic increase in restrictions because of COVID. And so obviously now we are living in a post-pandemic world where it shouldn't be an excuse anymore, but especially detention facilities have adopted these policies that came about during COVID to increase lockdowns, to increase body scans. Attorneys have to go through a full body scan to get into a facility. Decreasing access to attorneys, to family, all of those things. You can't have in-person visits with your family at all. And I'm wondering if you looked at kind of how those restrictions were, or the impermeability has increased post-COVID, compared to, like the 90s when you started to see those policies be introduced at a more rapid rate.
Yeah, I don't go all the way up through COVID. I was writing the book during COVID. But I will say that my own personal experience does confirm what you're saying on a milder scale than what you're talking about. But at the prison where I teach, there were lots of programs that were put on hiatus because of COVID, which were never invited back. And the ways in which that infrastructure just sort of dissolved. And so COVID was, again, sort of the initial reason, but then it kind of just became an excuse, whether it's just simply inertia or whether there's some stated, health concern or ostensible health concern. I don't know. But absolutely, I have seen COVID be an excuse. Another way that, COVID was an excuse and, or rather, created a fascinating situation in the prison where I work, is that in Oregon, well, let me back up for 1 second to just say, like, COVID was a really interesting and terrible case because the folks who were incarcerated, of course, were incredibly high risk. But again, with the language of risk, the public is made to think that their coming out is a greater risk to us, and that should be of more concern than the risk of whether the people inside live or die, right? But then around that, there was this myth that you can seal off the prison by just, being more stringent, when in fact, workers are going in and out all the time, and they're the ones who are actually bringing COVID inside. So the idea that the prison is totally or can be made impermeable, of course, is a fiction, right? Because there's always going to be people coming in and out. But in Oregon, at one point, when things were seeming to be opening up, I had a class scheduled that was, going to happen in, let's say, a month from whenever. And the governor issued a mask mandate that required correctional officers to wear masks. and, you know, for the prison to supply masks. And correctional officers refused to go to work because they were opposed to the mask mandate. So my class was canceled because the prison was understaffed. And of course, my thing is, well, let's see if we can still do it. I bet nothing goes wrong. Like, I bet we don't actually need all that staff. You know what I mean? But no, they shut it down. And I had to do a whole lot of work to get it started back up again. But I think that is something very, you know, worth tracking. And I think the in-person visits, absolutely, they have disappeared in a lot of places, right? And that was already a trajectory that was happening. And then, you know, COVID creates this kind of, you know, disaster excuse to increase the thickening of those walls. I agree. But I didn't research it because I was finishing it as that was happening.
Jim from Tahoe, you had a question? Please go ahead and unmute.
Hi, and thanks for taking my question. I have a relative who is incarcerated in a private prison in Texas, and or was, I'm not sure what the current status is, but I wondered if your research included any privately operated prisons, and if the situation in them is the same as or better or worse than the state operated prisons that you studied. Thanks.
That's a really great question. And I really should know more about that. I don't study private prisons in the book or in general. And I am aware, you know, of the fact of and the problematic nature of private prisons. But my attention to private prisons has not actually been so much to their conditions, which I would be very curious to know. But more to how they relate to the economy more broadly. And so I'm not really fully understanding, you know, what the experience is like of people inside as it might compare to state-run prisons. I sort of look at them more in a political economy sort of way in terms of their function in society. And I do need to do more work because I often guess this question. But one of the reasons why I sort of shy away is because I think that private prisons are in some way not a red herring because they're egregiously problematic for a lot of reasons. But focusing on the problem of private prisons really kind of in some ways deflects necessary attention to public prisons that are being, you know, run in our name with public funds, in which the majority of people are incarcerated. Only a, you know, minority of people are incarcerated in private prisons. What I think we do need to track is how private prisons are going to become more instrumental in this mass deportation scheme that seems to be on the horizon, which I know very little about, but I understand that there's probably going to be a need for space, and there are going to be, you know, companies that will step into the breach and probably want to provide those services. I wish I knew more, I'm sorry. But it's also interesting to know in terms of prison practices, not just conditions, you know, material conditions, but whether or not private prisons, you know, can have practices such as furlough or whatnot that aren't governed in the same way. I don't know. It's a really good question.
Also, from reading your book, Professor Hillyer, and now I'm wondering about the architectural design and location of private prisons versus the ones that are, you know, institutionalized way further out in the boondocks, so they have no access to urban centers, etc., and whether that's different with
No, that's true. In both state, federal, and private prisons, that is a major trend. Ever since the 1980s, there has been a boom in prison construction in rural areas. This is both cause and effect of increasing isolation, and one can think of that spatially and geographically, with people needing to drive 400 miles to see a loved one, or maybe risk that that person is going to be transferred another 1,000 miles away. I mean, that's the other thing, is that people who are incarcerated are seen as sort of fungible, and you've got, you know, overcrowding in Massachusetts, people get shipped to Texas, right? And, you know, this happens sometimes in the middle of the night, you know? And it's not just a matter of being far away from your family. It's also a matter of, like, you build a community in that prison. It's prison and it stinks, but you have a life there. You have people there that you have relationships with. You have clubs, you have achievements, you know how things work. You know, it's very, it's a kind of, you know, forced migration. But those rural prisons are also a kind of, you know, Keynesian stimulus, I guess you could say, to try to ostensibly revitalize economies that are getting, you know, defunct because of the rise of agribusiness and the demise of coal and all this kind of thing. And so a lot of those prisons are built in Appalachia, for example. Kentucky has an inordinate number of prisons, right? And so these are, again, right, spatial remove that sort of enhances the bigger narrative.
Well, thank you. Tyson, you had a comment about Alexei Navalny's book Patriot. Did you want to come off mute and you know, elaborate on what connection there might be? Well, all right. If Tyson's not comfortable going off mute, yeah, just put. Oh, okay. So he can't come off mute. So he was just asking if you had read the book Patriot, and whether, yeah. So no, I guess not.
Sorry.
All right, no
Are
worries.
you recommending it, or what?
Maybe you can drop some more comment in the chat.
Yeah.
Yeah, I haven't read it either, so I can't assume what connection there might be. So. Well, I'm not seeing any other. Oh, okay. It's about Russian prisons. And it is uplifting despite the ending. Yeah, okay. Okay. That did, when I first you know, I had the opportunity to kind of lead the Q&A, that was kind of like, and also when I attended your reading during the alumni weekend, I was thinking it was very interesting that, you know, you chose a historical analysis within the United States, because my thought was, oh, are there models internationally where maybe countries are actually doing this right? But I think it was actually more stark to read that we were doing it more right in a historical context, and particularly in a historical context that was rife with racism. But yeah, I am kind of curious, you know, what international comparisons you
Yeah.
might have come across.
Well, because I'm a US historian, I'm not doing those kinds of comparisons. But what I will say is that I'm interested in how American penologists make those kinds of comparisons. And one of the things that became sort of vogue in the 1950s and 60s, as more social science was being brought to bear to understand the problem of prison, understanding that it was a failure, right? I mean, every generation has sort of considered it to be a failure and tried reforms of various sorts. And in that period, and also since then, professional penologists and corrections administrators were very curious about traveling all over the United States, creating this network of sort of best practices, and people from California going to visit Mississippi, and penologists and correctional officials moving from state to state, doing work in one place and then trying to bring those practices elsewhere. But they also traveled abroad. And they often looked abroad when they were trying to make the case to to advocate for a particular innovation. And one of those was conjugal visits. And they, in particular, were looking at Mexican prisons and saw that conjugal visits were very successful there. I mean, this is according to their view. I mean, I don't know, you know what I mean? But like the point is, my interest is in their interest in, you know, looking at other ideas, what is now being infused into the public consciousness as a, you know, what is the window of political possibility? And is it even politicized in the way that it is now? In the 1950s, it wasn't. And people were in the same way, and people are, or to the same extent, people were going to Russia to look at Russian prisons. And there was an astonishing note by someone who was like, you know, this is really embarrassing that this Russian prison seems to be more humane than ours, right? This is in the middle of the Cold War. And of course, in more recent years, people have been going to Scandinavia and so forth, and trying to, you know, Scandinavianize certain practices, but that doesn't seem to have had a lot of legs, right? Because we have such a pushback.
Okay, thank you. Holly?
Yes, I had a question in regards to the students who participate in the Inside Out program. And for the students that are on the inside, do you know when they have completed their service, if they end up pursuing higher education as part of their experience within your program?
Yeah. I don't have like longitudinal data on that for my students. I know anecdotally that many of them do. Many of them go on to community college or finish community college. We do not. Oh, and we did have one student, one of my great students last year, Josiah, got into UT Austin, but he can't go because he's not allowed to leave the state. So, you know, there are all kinds of barriers. I mean, my dream, of course, is to create a pathway into Lewis and Clark. That is not something that's sort of been part of the identity or mission of the school, but I think that there's room to consider that. I know that the Inside Out nationally as a program definitely is collecting data on that and is, you know, tracking the progress of many of the folks who go on to higher education. And one great example of that, of course, is the Pitzer program, where students who are incarcerated can get a BA with all Inside Out classes. Like they offer enough Inside Out classes so that while people are incarcerated, they can get a BA made up of all Inside Out classes. They also have a Pathways program so that people who get out can get admission to Pitzer and enroll as a student. I think it's more for my students in this prison, it's probably more community college and maybe U of O. And also PSU, for sure PSU. I wouldn't say it's the majority. Most of them just need to work. But if they can take classes at community college, a lot of them are really revved up and excited and much more confident than they were before. And I'm hoping to, you know, offer some way institutionally at some point, you know, more support so that they can actually do that. But it's beyond my personal capacity right now. Which is why I want to study Evergreen's model and bring it back to Lewis and Clark and get alumni support to expand our program.
Well, I'm going to steal the floor again because I don't see anybody with a question. So are you familiar with the Pathfinder program that my wife, you know, many years ago participated in that and taught Pathfinder classes, and I think it might have even been at Columbia.
They definitely have it. I've never really understood what it was. I see signs about it all the time, and I know
really?
that students are involved in it. Yeah. I don't
so
know much about it.
it's gonna, yeah, so they have outside instructors who come in and, you know, teach empathy and self-reflection. And we actually have a good friend of ours who was inside for 20 years and said that like that has completely enabled him to be able to integrate after coming out. And he still watches Ancient Aliens, so he hasn't pursued higher education, but he is a much changed person for that. And so I'm just wondering if, so I'm glad to hear that that's still a program.
It is still there. And
Okay.
I guess one of the things that just comes to mind as you say that is that, in many ways I have in my class a very wonderful sampling of people. I can't generalize of, every single human who's incarcerated, right? But I've done enough work inside and done enough research, to know that it is not unusual to find incredibly reflective people inside who want to grow and want to be good people. And we all do. Or we hope we do. And there are folks inside who are, more reflective than people on the outside, more self-aware, and if they are lucky enough to have the support and the tools from something like Pathfinders, because maybe they, would have been in therapy if they had those kinds of resources, right? Throughout their early lives, right? Having that opportunity is a good way to spend your time inside. But again, that's a volunteer run program. That is not part of the mission of corrections. All these programs that happen are volunteers, right? They're not institutionalized mandates that are baked into the mission of the thing. It's all, despite the prison and not because of. Oh, Brooke has a.
Yeah, go ahead.
I am a millennial who doesn't know how to raise my hand on Zoom. So
Yay!
I was trying to figure it out. Anyway, I'm wondering, and I know that the nature of your work is to reflect on the past. I'm wondering if, in your heart of hearts, what you think would change, how we could usher in a change here, because I know, like what Jackson was touching on with the victims' rights lobbyists and district attorneys' offices having a really strong lobbying presence. It can be hard to counter that narrative that we need to put victims' rights over constitutional rights. But I'm wondering if, what do you see a pathway forward for creating more permeability, especially like we talked about with these COVID standards now?
Right.
What are you thinking?
Well, it's hard to know where to begin because not only do we have to change everything, but we're in a moment that is not particularly promising as far as the level of fear, the weaponizing of sensationalistic misinformation, the sheer hate and demonization that is going on makes it very difficult to find those pockets. But I think it's all about finding those pockets, like whether it's progressive prosecutors who are willing to set up, reviews to, sentence review boards or whatever, or whether it's governors like Wall Hillyer in Massachusetts, who said she's going to rewrite her clemency guidelines. I think that it's going to take journalists and storytellers and students. I mean, it involves changing the narrative, right? And so changing the narrative means changing everything. But I think that we just have to use all of the levers at our disposal, like, paying attention to local elections, paying attention when we conflate houselessness with crime, just in our day-to-day lives, being skeptical of a carceral worldview. I don't know what to say. I think in various professions, there are tools within those kinds of professions, within those milieus. And I'm hoping that the book, just provides a little bit of political cover. If the conversation is about, well, this is a radical change, this has never been done, this is crazy. Well, no, that's not the case. And I think that, by incrementally sort of practicing otherwise, you begin to change the common sense, because then you can point to those examples. And so those can become normalized instead of sensationalizing the exceptional examples of horror, right? Lifting up the examples that work. lifting up the alternatives to incarceration, you know, emergency response teams instead of involving police. I mean, all this stuff happens at the local level. So the good news about that is that ordinary people can make a difference. You don't have to be a policymaker or even a lawyer. But I wish I had a magic wand. I think contact is important. I mean, you know, if you care about this issue, you know, even just writing to people in prison, thinking about how to get books to people in prison, volunteering at a prison, you know, on that human level, that's a different way. But I also just think, you know, being aware and asking questions and not taking things at face value, not succumbing to fear mongering, being the critical humanistic thinker that all Lewis and Clark graduates are, to not take our present world as fixed.
Thank you. I like that political cover term, because I think a lot of times judges who are politicians, but judges and politicians, they don't have the courage to do what they know is right, and they do what is politically convenient or something to give everybody something. And so I like that framework. That's helpful.
Well, and it's not, you know, again, magic fairy dust, but there can be a situation where it's useful to say, this has happened before, and so we can make it happen again. I mean, this is all relatively recent. Like in Pennsylvania, you know, Dick Thornburgh commuted the sentences of 7 people, you know, in 8 years. But the governor before him commuted the sentences of over 600 people serving life without parole. You know, and then like that, it changed. So it also is sort of like a human level. Like Dick Thornburgh is just a person, you know what I mean? And so I don't know. It's the contingency of it is both frightening and exciting.
Well, thank you everybody so much. I mean, obviously, I can keep on doing this for another 3 hours at least. But as much as I'd love to do that, I think I have to be a little bit aware of everybody's time constraints.
Energy level and time. Yeah. Thank you.
Oh no, thank you. Emily, I think there's a recording, and so you'll send out a note to all the participants about the availability of that, so that we can, you know, seed the world with more of these ideas and share it with those who weren't able to make it. But yes,
appreciate
absolutely.
that.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I really
Mhm.
appreciate your attention. And you know, sometimes it's hard to feel energy from Zoom, but from your questions, I have a sense.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Reiko. Yep, everybody can unmute themselves and say goodbye or hello to Reiko.
Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you, Reiko.
Thank you.
Thank you.